Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you might be. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I am Safwan Masri. I'm the Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development at Columbia University, and it is really my honor to welcome you and to welcome our distinguished panelists today. When I was first approached to be a moderator for today's discussion on the prospects for climate action under the Biden administration, I found myself reflecting not on elections, laws, policies, or treaties, which we might call the how, but really on the why. It has been 20 years since the term Anthropocene entered popular culture. As you likely know, this term refers to a geological epoch in which the dominant influence on the environment and therefore climate is human behavior. Perhaps we have grown used to this idea and accept it as true, thus the urgency of policy issues. But do we stop to think about the seismic shift our timescale has undergone? Environmental changes, once tracked geologically using fossils and rock strata and occurring over millennia, are now happening in real time on our human scale. I find myself thinking of Shakespeare's Hamlet soliloquy, which once seemed inspiring and now sounds arrogant, with humanity noble in reason and infinite in faculty. In action, how like an angel. In apprehension, how like a god. The beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. There is a long tradition in Western culture that sees nature as the dominion of man, and I use the term man deliberately, with a relationship calibrated by hierarchy, with man slightly lower than the angels and moving down through women and children and the beasts of the fields and so on. Nature in this model is the subordinate, existing only to serve. This approach, embraced by individuals, governments, and industries, remained relatively unchallenged because nature was perceived as inexhaustible. But we are at the point where we can see that nature is, in fact, exhausted. Before our eyes, we are witness to the melting of glaciers, the rise in temperatures, and to deforestation so widespread it can be tracked from space. Incontrovertible proof of our human impact is also testimony to the possibility of real change. The standstill caused by the COVID pandemic allowed children in Mumbai to see blue sky for the first time, and fish returned to swim in the canals of Venice, delighting the city's inhabitants. Do we have an obligation, a moral obligation, to reverse or change what we have wrought? Everything that we experience on this planet is impacted by the quality of our environment, how we live, what we eat, what we can do for a living, whether we can see the sun in the sky or find water to slake our thirst. Environmental degradation drives migration, incites war, and causes disease. Philosopher and University of Cambridge professor Honora O'Neill's pioneering work in bioethics argues that we must move from individual rights to obligations, from the state to transnational, and that we are duty bound to address climate change. We are collectively imperiled if we do not. To help us understand our obligations individually and at the state and transnational levels, with a new dawn literally breaking in 27 hours from now, not that anyone is counting, we have with us three eminent scholars in climate, energy, and the environment who will discuss what we can expect in terms of actions and obligations from the incoming administration of the United States under President Biden. They are Jason Bordoff, founding director of the Center on Global Energy Policy and professor of professional practice in international and public affairs at Columbia University. Michael Girard, Andrew Sabin, professor of professional practice and director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School. And Kelly Sims Gallagher, academic dean and professor of energy and environmental policy at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Let us start with Jason Bordoff. Jason, you are one of the world's top energy policy experts. You served in the Obama administration as special assistant to the president and senior director for energy and climate change on the staff of the National Security Council. Prior to that, you held senior policy positions on the White House's National Economic Council and the Council on Environmental Quality. You have a unique perspective on what is possible in the next 4 years. May I invite you to share your initial thoughts on the Biden administration and climate change? Jason, over to you.
Safwan, thanks so much. And thanks for your leadership of the Columbia Global Centers and for that really eloquent introduction. Folks will understand why Michael and I count ourselves as privileged to have you as a colleague. And also, it's a good reminder of why Columbia University, under President Lee Bollinger's leadership, has made such an extraordinary institutional commitment to the challenge you described so eloquently, creating, having its trustees for the first time in, I think, 3 decades, create a new school at Columbia University, a school of climate change, to address this existential challenge for the 21st century. So let me just start with a few framing thoughts on what is about to change tomorrow at noon. There are many issues in which the landscape is going to change from a Trump administration to a Biden administration, perhaps no more so than climate change. I think just at a high level, I would make a few observations. First, the urgency. As important as a priority as climate change was in the Obama administration, you see that that same urgency, perhaps even more so in the Biden administration. If you look at the transition website, there's a button in the upper right-hand corner with 4 priorities for this administration, and climate change is one of them. There has been, that reflects a significant shift, I think, in the level of urgency, broadly speaking. If you look at demographic data, both sides of the aisle, obviously, Democrats starting from a much higher place than Republicans, but on both sides of the aisle, it's changing. And particularly with the younger cohort, younger demographics, it is changing. I think being driven by, first, how much time has been lost. So the pace of change to achieve anything close to well below 2 degrees, the goals of the Paris Agreement, is much steeper now than would have been the case if one had started before. And an increased sense of urgency driven by the impacts of climate change we are already seeing. This is not impacts in decades to come, but the impacts are here and now. And of course, our colleagues at Columbia who study the impacts of climate change, I think the more we learn, the more reason there is to be more concerned rather than less concerned. So really significant sense of urgency for the new administration coming in on this issue. The second is the connection between this issue and the other urgent priorities you'll see if you look at that drop-down menu, namely COVID, economic recovery, and racial justice. There is a very strong, I think you will see a very strong connection between climate action and green recovery. The idea that if, as my colleague Julio Friedman at the Energy Center on Global Energy Policy says, if we're serious about deep decarbonization for the next 3 decades, every week needs to be infrastructure week. We have a huge amount of investment and building we need to do, putting steel in the ground and building all sorts of infrastructure needed for a clean energy economy. And I think there'll be a major focus on how to link action on climate change to job creation, as well as a strong focus on equity and justice. And then the third broad framing point I would make is, I think it is notable and intentional, and Kelly can speak more to this, that President-elect Biden announced his international climate envoy, not as part of his environmental team, but as part of his national security team. And having someone of the experience and stature of Secretary Kerry with a seat on the National Security Council and cabinet rank is a signal that climate is going to be a very significant, not only domestic policy issue, but central to the conduct of foreign policy. You'll see that play out in a few different ways. So I'll just talk for a few minutes about what I think we'll see in the days, weeks, months to come. We've already seen reports that on day one, an executive order announcing the commitment to re-enter the Paris Agreement. That'll take 30 days roughly to take effect. Also, reports in the news yesterday and today that they will announce they're going to reverse the approval of President Trump of the Keystone Pipeline, oil pipeline between the U.S. and Canada. Re-entering the Paris Agreement is sort of table stakes, right? That's step one. You will see a significant diplomatic effort to elevate the level of ambition that countries have in Glasgow, the next UN International Climate Meeting, roughly a year from now. You also, I think, will see a strategy focused on how tools of financial and technical assistance can help develop implementation strategies for countries. Because while it is useful and necessary for countries to elevate their ambition, we shouldn't forget that many countries are still falling short of their Paris commitments, nevertheless promising to do more in Glasgow. And we need to think about strategies to help countries achieve their goals. A whole of government approach, you'll hear that phrase a lot. And I was part of this Climate 21 effort of some former administration officials and other experts that talked about how to build not each, but many of the agencies in the federal government to address the challenge of climate change. Some are obvious, like the EPA and the Department of Energy, but many others as well that don't always come top of mind when you think about climate, but have an important role to play. That's true in domestic policy. It's also true in foreign policy. You'll see, I think, the use of all tools of foreign policy and international economics to drive climate action. On the trade agenda, a return to, I assume, some sense of WTO norms, and then discussion about how to use trade rules to favor, to make it easier to treat differently things based on their carbon content, expand the scope of permissible subsidies that target clean energy. Efforts to work collaboratively with the European Union, say on border carbon adjustments, carbon tariff. But if the U.S. doesn't also elevate its own game through its domestic action, there's always the risk of being the target of those. So I think those could be an area of cooperation or potential conflict. Tools of multilateral finance. The U.S. now has the Development Finance Corporation, which is a successor to OPIC, and I think that has much more authority and more power. So that is an important lever that we have. About electricity is already half of critical development development assistance overseas. So thinking about how to target development assistance toward clean energy is really quite important. You heard President-elect Biden through the campaign talk about, for example, holding China accountable for its coal investments through Belt and Road. And I'd love to hear Kelly talk more about this, but you can't beat something with nothing. So if you want to go into emerging market countries in Southeast Asia or elsewhere and say, we have a better alternative financial package that works economically and also is a lower carbon package, the DFC, I think, would be one way to do that. Development assistance, fulfilling America's commitment to the Green Climate Fund. There'll be effort to multilateral debt relief through the Treasury Department. We saw debt for nature swaps in the 1990s. Maybe you could see some discussion about climate commitments as part of debt relief today. I think there'll be focus on rebuilding America's nuclear leadership, not only because we need more zero carbon nuclear power to meet deep decarbonization goals, but also because of national security concerns that right now China and Russia are largely the countries leading globally on nuclear power and therefore setting the rules and the norms for things like nuclear non-proliferation. And then finally, an effort to integrate climate fully into our foreign policy, not only as a problem to solve, but also a problem that can affect the success or failure of other foreign policy goals like security and stability. So, for example, a strategy for stability in Iraq may not be able to be effective unless it considers the impacts of water scarcity or heat waves on the Iraqi people or the loss of Iraq's oil revenue as we transition toward a lower carbon economy. The same with U.S. efforts to counterterrorism in North Africa, which may be challenged unless we also consider the impacts of climate change on desertification that may make local populations more vulnerable to terrorist promises. So you'll see this whole of government approach on the international side. I'll say just very briefly on the domestic side, because Michael Gerard, I think, will go much deeper on it. I sort of lump domestic action into three broad buckets. One is what you do in Congress across the aisle. One is what you may be able to do in Congress without bipartisan cooperation. And then the third is what you can do with executive authority. So you'll see working across the aisle, I think, to have additional stimulus packages because the economy just needs it. The economy is in a really deep hole. That's the situation in which President-elect Biden takes office. How can we deploy significant amounts of that toward renewables, retrofits of buildings, advanced vehicle manufacturing, public transportation, charging networks, again, things that put people to work and also build the clean energy economy we need. You can also get bipartisan cooperation on innovation and new technology. We saw in December, as part of the COVID relief bill, $40 billion go toward clean energy R&D. And that's really, you especially get bipartisan cooperation when you take a broad approach to how we think about the new technologies there, not just renewables and batteries, but advanced nuclear, carbon capture, carbon removal, hydrogen. And we're going to need all of those technologies. The International Energy Agency projects that in a net zero by 2050 scenario, half of the cumulative emission reductions between now and 2050 come from technologies that are not yet commercially available. So we're going to need more innovation. There may be an opportunity to work across the aisle on things like a carbon tax or clean electricity standard, but that's to be seen whether that's going to be possible. And then, of course, the Democrats now control by a very narrow majority both the Senate and House. And so there are things that may be possible to do even without bipartisan cooperation. The filibuster seems likely to stay, but you can do budget reconciliation a few times a year. Things that would either spend money or raise money, like a carbon tax, may be able to be done through reconciliation. And then finally, the Biden administration will have significant executive authority, and I'm sure Michael will speak more to this, so I won't really say much about it, that under the Clean Air Act, that the EPA can use to regulate emissions from power plants, cars, trucks, a lot of executive authority over federal lands, public lands, so expanding, say, the offshore leasing for the development of offshore wind, government procurement. There's a host of tools that exist even without congressional action, which can be quite significant as well. So to recap, a whole of government approach is what we'll see, a big focus on economic recovery linked to climate action, both executive authority and then also what may be possible through Congress. I think the initial focus will be very much on what can be done through spending and a stimulus bill, which again makes sense given how deep a hole the economy's in and how cheap the cost of government borrowing is right now to invest today for the kind of economy we need for the future. And all of this can make a huge dent in the problem, but not sufficient to where we need to get to take targets like well below 2 degrees seriously. So we still need technological innovation. We still need stronger support in Congress for comprehensive climate legislation. And we need more international cooperation to elevate ambition globally, because it is a global problem. It doesn't matter where a ton of CO2 comes from. Every ton contributes equally. So we all have to act collectively. So let me stop there, and I look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you. That was brilliant. I mean, really mapping out what we should expect from the Biden administration and laying out the issues, many of which we will come back to and hear from Michael, certainly on the legislative and on the executive authority dimensions, domestic dimensions, and from Kelly on the foreign diplomacy dimensions, China, but not only China. And I think it'll be great, Kelly, in a couple of minutes, also when we hear from you, to hear about the choice of John Kerry, both as John Kerry and his stand on climate, but also as the former Secretary of State, and how that might help. Jason, before I turn to Michael and Kelly, if I could just go back to the last point that you made, which is you spoke a lot about what you see the Biden administration doing, what they're planning to do, what some of the actions that we will see on day one. But towards the end, you spoke a little bit about the additional stuff that the Biden administration may not have declared that it is doing, but where you think it should also focus attention. So could you just very quickly talk to us about what they should do in addition to what they plan to do, just to paint it for us. Thank you.
Well, I think the Biden administration's climate agenda that they've laid out is really quite comprehensive and does adopt this whole of government approach, which I think is very important. I'm hard pressed to identify tools that they have at their disposal that they have not committed to use. My point was simply that I think the things that may be possible to achieve without agreement, durable, sustainable agreement, so some consensus, presumably across the aisle in Congress, presents a challenge for the end state we need to get to, which is, net zero by 2050. So I think with the tools that exist of spending through economic recovery, the regulatory tools, executive authority, the things that can be done through Congress today, that can make a really big difference and can put us on a pathway. First, to decarbonize electricity by 2035, and given the investments that were made a decade ago in solar and wind and batteries and R&D, often in many cases through the Recovery Act a decade ago, that puts us in a position today where we are in a much better position to think seriously about what it would look like to decarbonize the electricity sector, because the cost of doing so is so much cheaper. Solar and wind compete very favorably now, in some cases without any government support. Making those same investments today so that a decade from now, the sectors of the economy that are more challenging to decarbonize, shipping and aviation and trucks and heavy industry, we have a broader solution set to achieve those. And then I do think, and I'd be interested to hear Michael Gerard's view of this, as powerful a tool as the existing authority that the government has through things like the Clean Air Act is, ultimately to get to a decarbonized economy and to work with the rest of the world on doing that on a global basis. I think we'll need comprehensive legislation, and that can take different forms, standards, or a cap on emissions, cap and trades, whatever form that takes, to achieve that deeper decarbonization and have that policy be durable over time, recognizing that inevitably the White House and Congress is going to flip between parties. So a big part of what we need to do is not just legislative or executive action or policy, but building the public sense of concern and urgency that maintains support for those policies over time, regardless of which party is in power.
Great, thank you. So let's turn to Michael. Michael Gerard, in addition to being the former chair of the American Bar Association's 10,000 member section of Environment, Energy, and Resources, you're the author or editor of 13 books, including Global Climate Change and U.S. Law, the first and leading work in its field. Michael, talk to us, please, if you don't mind, about what you expect the road ahead to look like for the Biden administration on the legal front. I like the way that Jason framed it, in that there are three sort of venues for action, right? Working through Congress across the aisles, working through Congress without the need for bipartisanship, and through executive authority. So perhaps you can comment on that as well, and take it as broadly as you would like to.
Thank you very much, Safwan. So on the day that President Trump was inaugurated, the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law launched a website called the Climate Deregulation Tracker. And over the past 4 years, we've seen how the Trump administration has systematically worked to demolish all of the federal environmental, especially climate change programs that they could. They didn't do a very good job of it because they didn't rigorously follow the administrative procedures that are necessary, but they did a lot of damage. Tomorrow, we are rebranding that site the Climate Re-Regulation Tracker, because we know that there's going to be a great deal of positive movement within the existing executive authority of the government. Jason mentioned that it's already come out that President Biden will be canceling the Keystone XL pipeline. I wouldn't be surprised if we also see a moratorium on federal leasing of federal lands for oil and gas and coal extraction. The single action that the Obama administration took that had the greatest quantitative impact in reducing greenhouse gases was doubling the fuel economy standards for light-duty vehicles. Transportation is now the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. And so the Obama administration, working with the state of California and the auto industry, worked to greatly strengthen the fuel economy and the emission standards. Trump rescinded all of that. As soon as it became clear that Biden had won the election, the signal went out to and was received by the automobile manufacturers that we're going back in the other direction. We are moving toward much stronger fuel economy standards, and the future needs to be electric. The only way we achieve deep decarbonization is to get away from the internal combustion engine entirely. Going through the formal process to strengthen the automobile and fuel economy standards will take at least months because it's a formal process, but the signal has already gone out to the manufacturers that this is what's coming, and they are responding accordingly. We also are fairly confident that the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is in the Department of the Interior, is going to move forward much more quickly with the approval of offshore wind. Offshore wind is one of the most promising sources of clean energy. It's also emerging as a major potential source of employment in the United States. The Trump administration slowed it down. There are a lot of projects that want to get into the approval pipeline that have been slowed down, and I think we'll see that pick up quickly. The Trump administration greatly weakened the regulations under the National Environmental Policy Act, the federal statute that requires preparation of an environmental impact statement for major federal actions that can have a significant effect on the environment. And the revisions meant that there's much less consideration of climate change and other impacts. I think that the administration will move to reverse those changes, most of those changes, but the signal has already gone out to the people who are writing the environmental impact statements that you need to include this kind of consideration. Likewise, the Trump administration greatly weakened the regulations under the Endangered Species Act. I think we'll see that reversed. A more difficult area, and Jason has already alluded to this, is the Clean Air Act. The Obama administration adopted the Clean Power Plan, which was a set of regulations designed to reduce the use of coal to generate electricity. That plan was stayed by the Supreme Court in February of 2016. The Trump administration, as Trump promised during his campaign, repealed that and introduced a basically toothless new regulation called the Affordable Clean Energy Rule. That's all in the middle of litigation. I don't think that the Biden administration will just reintroduce the Clean Power Plan as it was, because it has certain legal vulnerabilities. But there are a lot of tools under the Clean Air Act that I think they will try to use. They can strengthen the emission standards for conventional air pollutants and for hazardous air pollutants that come from the same sources, like coal-fired power plants that generate a lot of greenhouse gases. They will probably look at strengthening the national ambient air quality standards for fine particulate matter and ozone, two pollutants that continue to cause thousands or tens of thousands of premature deaths in the United States every year. And tightening of those standards can also lead to the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. But that's a process that will take at least months to get through. I think we'll also see more action in financial regulation. I think that the Securities and Exchange Commission may strengthen the requirements for disclosures by publicly traded corporations into the effect of climate regulation and of climate change itself on companies, and help drive better corporate behavior. The Federal Reserve and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission have already indicated that they see climate change as a risk to financial stability in the United States. And so we may see more controls on the financial sector in terms of what kinds of investments it could make in greenhouse gas intensive activities, and what kind of protections need to be taken against the impacts that climate change will have on lots of companies. Another agency that I think will play an important role is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which of course regulates large aspects of the electricity and natural gas sectors. depending on the timing of various retirements and Senate confirmations and so forth, there's likely to be a Democratic majority in FERC around June. And when that happens, I think that we'll see FERC be more encouraging of renewables and less encouraging of fossil than it has been under Trump. And Trump, it was going in the other direction. We may see FERC and the Department of Energy move to use existing authority to encourage the siting of electric transmission lines. So since we're going to need a whole lot of transmission lines for the massive amount of wind and solar that we're going to need in order to achieve the decarbonization goals. Now, everything I've talked about is what can be done with existing authority. And we can later talk about what new legislation might accomplish, but the things I've talked about, you don't need Congress for at all. The Biden administration will be able to do on its own.
Okay, great. Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much to come back to, which we will. But let's sort of delve into the global sphere beyond actions on the domestic level. So, Kelly, would love to turn to you with a couple of questions. Kelly, just like Jason, you served in the Obama administration, but as a senior policy advisor in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and as senior China advisor in the Special Envoy for the Climate Change Office at the U.S. State Department. Among your many other accomplishments, you are currently serving on the board of Energy Foundation China. So let's talk about China and expand from it, if you will. President Xi Jinping has announced that China will aim for carbon neutrality by 2060, as Jason mentioned in his introduction. On the other hand, President Biden has consistently said he would hold China accountable for its global investments in coal projects through the Belt and Road Initiative. Doing so would require offering viable options for emerging market countries as an alternative to Chinese investments. So talk to us, Kelly, if you don't mind, about the ways that you could envision the Biden administration pushing China to deliver faster progress, and maybe even talk about potential areas of cooperation between both countries in climate matters. Do you see that as a possibility? So over to you, Kelly.
Thank you. Before I get to China, I'd like to talk about the U.S. approach to climate foreign policy more generally, and then I'll zero in on China. And I'd like to begin by saying that I think the United States needs to take a very strong dose of humility in our initial approach. For the whole rest of the world, the way the United States appears is that we pushed really hard to encourage countries to increase ambition and join the Paris Agreement, and we negotiated that agreement diligently, and I think in good faith. But then, of course, because of the Trump administration, the United States literally walked away from the Paris Agreement, didn't uphold any of its commitments on climate finance or in terms of domestic action. And so we're not coming to foreign policy from a position of strength right now. And so to me, the first and most important step is actually an intensive effort on domestic policy and getting our own house in order. And that would then put us in a much better position in terms of our foreign policy on climate. And I hope you'll come back and ask me in a minute what I think that domestic policy wish list should be. But I'll mention one area that kind of relates to both, and that's investments. So in terms of US and domestic investments in infrastructure, like Michael was just saying, and I think Jason earlier, we badly need to intensify our investments in infrastructure. And I have called for many times, some version of an infrastructure bank, a development bank, climate bank, green bank, I don't care what you call it, But we need to be able to start de-risking investments and really mobilize huge volumes of investment in climate resilience and mitigation. We need to be able to move money to community banks all around the United States so everyone has equitable access to this finance. And the kind of analog on the foreign side is that we do have a new tool that didn't exist during the Obama administration, which is the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, which so far has not actually been mobilized yet to help the climate cause. And I think a very important step that can be taken right away is to direct those investments towards clean energy and climate resilience and adaptation overseas. And of course, to prohibit investments in fossil fuels. And relatedly, US development aid, and here I'm thinking of the agenda for USAID, should really go into capacity building in countries around the world to help them understand which policies would help them get on track for reducing emissions. And this kind of brings me to China, because as Jason mentioned, the United States really has not had an alternative, a compelling alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative, which is, Xi Jinping's signature initiative to finance infrastructure in developing countries. And much of the BRI finance has actually been in energy, and almost all of that has been in fossil energy, coal, oil, and gas. And if you look at those patterns of investments in South Asia and in Africa, you can see that many of those developing countries actually are actively seeking finance in coal, oil, and gas as they begin to develop. And what they really need to do is start thinking about what are the cleaner pathways that are economically viable for them that would put countries in those regions on a pathway to climate neutrality by mid-century. Nobody should be building new coal-fired power plants anymore if we're serious about adhering to a 2 degree or 1.5 degree temperature goal. I think that the final two pieces of US climate foreign policy is our approach to kind of our bilateral relationships, US, EU, US, Japan, US, China, US, India. And there's, I think, a particular agenda for each one of those relationships. And then, of course, our approach to the multilateral negotiations, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And one of the toughest things for us is going to be developing our own new updated nationally determined contribution, the NDC, which is our target. And it is expected that we will increase our ambition, even though we are way off track for our original Paris Agreement target, which was that we were going to reduce our emissions 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. It's hard to envision how we get there without an extraordinary effort and probably climate legislation in the United States. And we actually need to increase that ambition further to comply with the Paris Agreement. And I think that will be challenging. The EU just recently announced it's moving to a 55% below 1990 levels by 2030. And that's going to be hard for us to match. So let me pause there, and happy to come back on any of these.
Thank you. So let me ask you about your wish list for the domestic policies that you would recommend. Kelly.
Oh, thanks. Okay, well, great. I mean, I think that the first thing that is important for us to do is to clarify our long-term goal. Are we committed to the net zero by 2050? And I would like to see that enshrined in legislation. I could envision a climate bill that was almost a framework bill where we just said our goal as a country is to get to net zero by 2050. That would allow us to construct a national emissions budget and make clear, how much can we emit during this period? And that would create some discipline. I think that would be helpful for Congress. Congress is used to working with budgets of, unfortunately, too many deficits. But if we could then construct shorter term emission budgets, I think that would create the kind of discipline we need. We need to do that infrastructure investment, whether it's electric vehicles, grid, public transit, rail, buildings, resiliency. We need to mobilize that finance. We need to deal with our two big sources of emissions, the power sector. And of course, that could be done through a cap and trade or carbon pricing approach or a clean energy standard. And then transportation. So as Michael said, the fuel economy standard or a ZEV mandate, something like that seems appropriate. And then the last two pieces are really about investing in ourselves. So I would advocate big new investments in education, for public health and climate, sort of like a GI Bill for anyone who wants to work on those two topics. And also the vocational training so that we are positioning our workforce to be able to excel in these clean energy industries in the future, and then investments in energy RD&D, clean energy RD&D. And I would recommend a doubling or tripling of those investments over the next 10 years.
Thank you. So I know Jason wants to interject, so I'm going to turn it over to you, Jason, in a second, but I'd love for us to also pick up on what Kelly has just shared in terms of education and the, GI Bill on education, and maybe from that, the question is, how do we deal with the cultural aspects of climate change, right? The educational, the knowledge. How do we deal with the rise of climate denial that we have seen over the past 4 years? And I'm happy for any of you to address that. But over to you, Jason.
I just wanted to respond quickly to Kelly's great remarks, and it was as excited as those who are seeking stronger climate action presumably are about the change in DC. It should give us a moment of pause, because what we heard her say totally correctly is, the world needs you to. The proof is in the pudding. We're going to have a lot of re-engagement. I assume Secretary Kerry will be traveling all around the world often to elevate ambition, engage in climate diplomacy. We'll have an ongoing dialogue with the Europeans and others, which will be welcome by those who have been continuing to move on this challenge. But then they're going to want to see that we're able to really deliver. And she noted the importance of taking strong domestic action as, that's the starting point before you drive international action. And then when you asked her, well, what would you want to do? She listed several things that come back to the point I made a moment ago, and you pressed me with a follow-up on, which is there are limits. We have 51-50 with some somewhat conservative or moderate senators like Joe Manchin in the mix there. We're not going to get Congress to pass legislation agreeing to net zero by 2050. I think we'll spend, I don't know how many, couple $100 billion or whatever we're able to spend through a stimulus package. We're not going to government spend our way toward deep decarbonization. We will use existing authorities, the EPA, the Clean Air Act, and everything else. But she, I think, said what I said before, which is we need Congress to act. You need to set limits on emissions. You either do it economy-wide, so carbon price, you do it sector by sector, clean electricity standard, different sectors. And I think even with a thin blue margin in the US Senate, is reason to be skeptical we're going to get there. And so that means with the tools we have at our disposal, given where our political consensus is right now, you can imagine, I don't know exactly how depends how you model this stuff, in the mid 30s in terms of a percentage reduction by 2030 or something. And I don't think that'll be sufficient for what the rest of the world is expecting from us, or to get on a pathway to net zero by 2050, or the kind of NDC ambition I hope we will have, which would be somewhere closer to 45% or even up to 50 or something, has to be realistic and achievable. And that's going to be challenging with the tools that we have right now and the political consensus that isn't yet where it needs to be in Washington.
If I could say a few more words about the legislative, and I agree with Kelly that it would be terrific to have a framework law and a national goal, but we need a lot more specific legislative authorization. This 6-3 conservative majority on the Supreme Court is not going to be sympathetic to broad legislative mandates that don't have very specific requirements imposed on the agencies. And so, in the ideal world, we would have a price on carbon, which would have all kinds of effects throughout the economy, but it faces challenges from both the right and the left. We know that Republicans don't like a price on carbon. They don't like to spend money on certain things. And there's also a lot of resistance in the environmental justice community, which is deservedly very influential in the Biden administration, to carbon pricing. So I'm not optimistic that an economy-wide price on carbon, either through a direct carbon tax or cap and trade, is going to be enacted in this Congress. I think a national clean energy standard may be slightly more likely, but still faces a lot of headwinds. Strengthening of the Clean Air Act is very important, taking away the ambiguities that were problems for the Clean Power Plan. An explicit zero emission vehicle ZEV mandate, I think, would be very important. I think that there's much more that the administration can and probably will do to restrict methane emissions, methane being another very important greenhouse gas. Surprisingly, the appropriations bill, the authorization bill that was just passed by Congress, has a strong program on hydrofluorocarbons, which were a major problem. I think we need Congress to get rid of the fossil fuel subsidies. That can only be done by Congress. That could be done through reconciliation, through a bare majority, but I don't know if we have the votes there. Now, we've just been talking about the federal level, but there's an awful lot that states can do. And, 29 states have renewable portfolio standards. Many states have adopted their own greatly ambitious climate plans. There's also a lot that cities can do. So the federal government isn't the only level that can do it. If in most areas we don't have federal preemption, states are allowed to go beyond what the federal government does. Motor vehicle standards are an important exception to that, but at a minimum, the federal government ought to get out of the way and allow the states to proceed. With all of that, I'm still not sure how we get to zero carbon electricity by 2035 and net zero economy-wide, but I think we'll make a lot of progress. And I also have to mention the requirement for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Jason's center has done a huge amount of work on that. We're working on that. Another huge public works program will be developing and building out the technologies to remove the CO2 from the atmosphere. There's already too much there, and we need to be doing very aggressive action in that direction, on top of everything we do to increase efficiency and move away from fossil fuels.
Michael, if I can just follow up with you, I mean, with your, if I may characterize it as pessimism about being able to levy a tax on carbon fuels, what about international trade? And are we going to be able to impose tariffs or deal with imports differently depending on the carbon content? And do you see the Biden administration moving in that direction? How do we work with the World Trade Organization? So could you comment on that?
Yeah, and Kelly and Jason will probably have more to say about this. There's certainly talk about border carbon adjustments, and if they are done the right way, they can be done in a way that is consistent with the WTO. Calculating it is extraordinarily complicated, and you'll have huge fights about what is really the carbon intensity of of given products. You've got complicated supply chain issues because many things are not manufactured just in one place, and the sources of supply vary a lot, and it's hard to account for that. It also invites a lot of retaliation from other countries. So I understand the theory of these border carbon adjustments, but the implementation of them is very challenging.
Kelly, Jason, on that?
I would just say that it ties back to what Kelly said, which is sort of linking to our ability to put domestic action in place, right? The legal defensibility for our carbon border adjustment is sort of leveling the playing field. So you put say a carbon price, if that's the policy tool you adopt, you put a carbon price on your domestic industry. You don't want them to be disadvantaged relative to imports that may come from places without a similarly stringent climate policy. Likewise, you wouldn't want them to be disadvantaged if they were to export to those places. So you would impose a carbon a border adjustment on imports. You might exempt exports, but then you need to have a strong domestic climate regime in place to defend that in international trade rules. And then, as Michael said, it's very complicated to know both the carbon content of imports, a roll of steel, aluminum, depending on the electricity that's being used to make it, as a coal or hydropower, nevertheless a car or something. And then also, how do you evaluate the stringency of different climate regimes? If one country pursues a carbon price, a carbon tax, another a cap and trade system, another a clean electricity standard, how do you figure out if these are kind of roughly comparable? That is very complicated.
Each of you spoke about infrastructure, the importance of infrastructure, right? And big plans, massive infrastructure programs that would increase solar and wind generation, energy storage capacity, energy efficient buildings, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, public transit, and so on and so forth. Those are going to require huge appropriations from Congress. We also have financial resources that are needed to deal with the COVID-related health and economic emergency. So can we talk for a minute about the viability of the very ambitious infrastructure program, which some of you may argue is not even ambitious enough. But just in terms of, from a practical perspective, what do you think the major hurdles will be? And what do you think we might be seeing and what we might not? And Kelly?
If I could jump in on this one. One of the principal advantages that I see to establishing an infrastructure bank or green bank or whatever we want to call it is that after that initial authorization, the bank can over time reinvest in itself. And so we've seen Germany's development bank, the KfW, grow over many, many years to increase its capacity to lend. And you can also look at the China Development Bank. The United States is trying to compete internationally against countries that have banks like this, and we still lack this kind of source of competitiveness. So yes, it would require an initial authorization, but then I think over time the bank can reinvest in itself. And more importantly, having a public bank that is supporting these efforts de-risks the investments, and that in turn mobilizes private sector finance. And that's how we can really get to the large volumes that are required to really make the energy transition that we need to make. There's no way this is going to be done solely through public finance. So we really need to work on identifying those tools and institutions that will mobilize private capital. If I can say beyond the bank, we have other tools at our disposal, whether it's investment tax credits, which were used to great effect in the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act, or loan guarantees, which we have found to be very effective in energy as well. So there are other policy tools at our disposal. In particular, the loan guarantees have a pretty limited impact on the public purse, and could be a useful tool going forward.
Thank you, Kelly.
I'll just quickly say one thing about that. Totally agree that whatever amount of public spending there is going to be dwarfed by the private capital that is available to come in, and need to think about how to make that happen, including through policy that changes incentives for where in the energy sector private capital goes. One additional point, and Michael may have thoughts about this too, it's really hard to build stuff in this country right now. And that's not just true for oil and gas pipelines, that's true for transmission lines for clean energy. I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about this over the summer. Russell Gold at the Wall Street Journal wrote a great book about trying to build, a high voltage transmission line project for clean energy. How that couldn't work, which people are trying to build hydropower transmission in the US right now. Great work done recently out of Princeton with a modeling scenario to achieve net zero by 2050. And if you look at their map of the US today and their map in 2050 in a high renewable scenario, the amount of land covered with solar, wind, and transmission lines is pretty significant. And because of the environmental review process, local opposition, and that environmental review process is very important. We need to do a rigorous environmental analysis before we put infrastructure in the ground because of harm to local habitats and endangered species and others. But we need to make that process work more better if we are going to build the kind of energy infrastructure that we need to get deep decarbonization in any reasonable time frame.
It's exactly right. About a year and a half ago, we put out a very large book called Legal Pathways to Deep Decarbonization in the United States that has more than 1,000 specific recommendations on federal and state and local action to move toward more renewables, more efficiency, everything else we need. And a good chunk of it is these important but cumbersome environmental review processes. And we've made some specific recommendations on how that can be sped up through regional reviews and a number of other methods. But I think that's going to be another important area where I think we can see some bipartisan consensus on helping to move that forward.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. We have so many questions from the audience, and I want to turn to them in a second. But let me just go back to the theme I raised 10, 15 minutes ago, and that is, we're all convinced of this, and obviously the Biden administration is convinced of this, and all of our audience members, I have to assume, are convinced of this. Otherwise, they would not be attending this webinar and wouldn't be posing questions. How do you deal with those who don't believe in this? And I don't know how significant, but I do know that it is significant, at least looking within the United States. And so tomorrow we will have a new administration and a new reality, and we can't just assume that just because we have that, everybody's going to be behind everything. So how do we deal with this? Maybe if we could just spend a minute on that, and then I'll turn to the questions.
Well, hopefully it'll make a big difference that we no longer see all these lies spewing from the top about climate change, about elections, about the vaccine and the virus and so forth. It's deeply corrosive, but we will still hear those voices. And social media and certain media outlets and so forth are heading us down a very bad rabbit hole. And I wish I had a real solution to that.
Great. So
I'll make
stopping the lies is a great first step.
I'll make two comments about it. One is it has been actually the majority of the American people have accepted the reality of climate change for some time. I think one challenge for a while has been the fact that it's been relatively low on the priority list when you ask people how important climate is relative to the economy, jobs, healthcare, crime, other things. It is remarkable how much that has changed in recent years. And as I said, particularly true when you break it down by demographics and cohorts. So the younger population clearly thinks this is very high in the top 3 or maybe 5, depending on the survey set of priorities. That sense of urgency, the same way, we just last year celebrated the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And that was a moment in our country's history 50 years ago where 1 out of every 10 Americans came into the street to say, we can't live this way anymore. And it was Republicans and Democrats, urban and suburban. We can't have air we can't breathe, and rivers and streams we can't swim in, or water we can't drink. Someone has to do something about this. We need that sense of urgency to build for the problem of climate change. And we're moving in that direction. I don't think we're at that quite that same level of urgency as, say, we were in 1970 for local pollution. We can come back to that, but that's one point. The second point I wanted to make was, I think we need to think much more seriously, and it's beyond just the climate community, about issues of a just transition, and thinking about who the dislocated communities are that will be, that feel like they will, and rightly feel like they will be harmed by this transition. In the US, you talk about coal communities or certain communities. We've done work on the municipal funding base of communities that have traditionally relied on revenue from oil, gas, and coal sectors. It's exponentially more true when you take a global perspective on this challenge and look at Poland and the European Union and the difficulty getting the EU on board with strong climate policy. 500,000 people work in the coal sector in India, and another million work for the rail. And the number one source of revenue for the railway is coal, which then subsidizes the cost of passenger rail. So how do you think about moving a country like that toward a very different fuel mix? These are issues of economic policy, economic development, and I think in the climate community, we need to work more with them on how to facilitate a transition that recognizes there will be people who are adversely impacted, both from the impacts of climate change, but also the solutions to climate change, and develops better solutions to make sure that as a matter of just transition, they're addressed.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's now turn to the questions. There's so many of them. So the audience, people who have posed questions, please forgive me because I know that we will not be able to get to all of them. And I tried to lump a few together. So there's a good number of questions related to the Paris deal. And we know that tomorrow, President Biden will sign an executive order that re-enrolls the United States in that. The questions have to do with the targets. Okay, what targets will be set? What targets might be realistic for the US? When might it be realistic to have those targets in place? Kelly, I see you nodding, so I'm gonna turn to you to answer that question.
Yes, thank you. Well, those are important questions. So first of all, assuming President Biden does, as we all expect, and rejoins the Paris Agreement, there's a 30-day waiting period. So the US could be back in to Paris by the end of February as a technical matter. Now, many countries have already updated their targets, these NDCs, nationally determined contributions. Many of them, in fact, did that in December, but the United States has still not done that. So, the EU, as I mentioned earlier, updated its target to the 55% below 1990 levels by 2030. China also enhanced its target, some of its targets, increasing its carbon intensity target, increasing its non-fossil share and primary energy target, et cetera. And the United States is also obliged to do this. I think no later, it's a little bit ambiguous because the deadline was actually the Conference of Parties in 2020, but because that was postponed due to the pandemic, we've got some helpful ambiguity here. So my expectation is that it's going to take a little bit of time for the Biden administration to figure out, in fact, what is possible. It's these, what policy pathways are possible, what legislative pathways are possible. I think it's going to be very important to do everything that can be done to ensure we actually can meet the target for the credibility reasons that I raised earlier. So I would expect that the United States might announce its updated NDC maybe in the June timeframe. And I say June because I don't think they want to wait too long, because they also want to try to accelerate ambition in other countries. So many countries are going to be waiting to see what does the United States do before they themselves update their own targets. And once the United States announces its target, it can then go on a bilateral basis and discuss with other countries what they might be able to do to enhance their own ambition. And then, of course, the Glasgow meeting is scheduled for next November. And so that'll be the absolute latest that the United States could do it as a technical matter.
I just
Thank
want to highlight, I agree with all that. I just want to highlight the disconnect between these national targets, the NDCs, and the Paris temperature targets. Because, of course, in Paris, the target was to try to keep the increase in global average temperatures within well below 2 degrees centigrade, 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, above pre-industrial conditions, and try to keep it closer to 1.5 degrees. Then the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said that we really need to keep it at 1.5 degrees because even 2 degrees is horrible. All of the national pledges that we have seen would take us to a world well over 3 degrees. And I don't think that the new targets we'll see will get us much below 3 degrees. And so first, that highlights how urgent a problem this is. And second, it highlights the importance of focusing not only on mitigation, on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also on adaptation, on preparing for the extreme heat and extreme precipitation and flooding and wildfires and all the other things that we've seen accelerate and under any scenario are going to get a whole lot worse. And so adaptation is as important as mitigation and will be for decades.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Kelly. So the issue of carbon tax has come up in a few questions, right? And people are asking, do we move beyond that? Given, for example, what we heard from Michael about the unlikelihood that is going to move forward. Maybe Kelly or Jason, we can hear from you. I mean, do you agree with Michael? Do you think that this is something that still has a chance? I mean, how do you see that evolving?
You want to go first, Jason?
I think Michael rightly observed the challenges with prospects for a carbon tax increasing on both sides of the aisle, increasing taxes, not just for Republicans, but for many Democrats, and then also an increasing skepticism or concern about a carbon tax as sort of the primary tool one uses from many parts of the left, which is a shift, right? I mean, a carbon tax was the centerpiece of Bernie Sanders' climate plan when he ran for president. Secretary Hillary Clinton didn't even kind of go that far, and now a carbon tax is viewed as too incremental, too cautious, and also, as Michael said, raises many concerns in the environmental justice community. And I think we can get into those, and there are real concerns. I think depending on what you do with the revenue from a carbon tax, many can be addressed. I think a carbon tax, in my view, does more than many realize to reduce emissions and can actually make a pretty big dent in the problem. I don't think we are going to government spend our way out of this problem or even use existing EPA regulations. I think it's a political economy question, and there's been a lot of good work that political scientists have done recently about whether it's fine for many economists to sort of study a carbon tax and model, as some here at Columbia and at the Center on Global Energy Policy have, how significant the reductions could be from it, but then it doesn't actually show up in practice because of a set of political realities that make it hard to design the optimal carbon tax. Now, I think that's true. I think my reaction to that is it's also hard to design the optimal policy for some alternatives to a carbon tax. So if you're thinking about a sector-based standards or other things, there's evidence around the world that those often fall short in practice and in implementation too, because of the set of political compromises that need to be put together. I think at this point, the difference in economic efficiency, are you paying a little bit more per ton of abated because you're using a standard versus a tax? Those are all exceeded by the damages of climate change itself. So I think most of those options, we should take a broad view on what we think makes sense. And I do think when we talk about sector-based standards, which I think is the approach the Biden administration is likely to take, a clean electricity standard, standards for transportation, standards for the industrial sector, you can design those to mimic many of the benefits of a carbon price, the sort of market driven approach that says government doesn't determine where the cheapest reductions will come from. You sort of let actors in that sector figure it out, because we don't necessarily know yet what the cheapest way will be to decarbonize cement or steel. So you set a standard with some tradability of permits within the sector, within the standard, and that starts to look kind of like a cap and trade program for any individual sector. I think you can capture some of the benefits some like about market-based instruments like a carbon price, even with a sector-based standard approach. But we're going to need limits like that, whatever form they take. And I will just say, I do think the concerns about progressivity, we've done a lot of work on how to think about winners and losers from a carbon price. You can't have a strong view on how inequitable or regressive a carbon price is without also deciding what you're going to do with the revenue. Because if you use the revenue to try to address some of those impacts, you can address many of them.
I just want to jump in and make two quick points. The first is that it's supremely ironic that the United States advocated for market-based solutions to climate change policy for years. And yet we're the one country that really hasn't pursued market-based solutions at the national level. The EU now has a robust emissions trading system, and even China, a communist country, has established a national emissions trading system. And even countries much, much poorer than we, for example, India, tax coal. There's a coal cess in India. So we have developed an almost irrational allergic reaction to a very sensible policy approach. I've answered a couple of questions in the chat, but what I would just like to say is any amount of carbon pricing would be helpful. It just starts, again, orienting the whole economy towards the direction we need to be going in, creating the right proper market signals in the economy. I'm skeptical that we're going to get to high levels of carbon pricing in the United States, given that we don't even have, $1 per ton or a penny per ton, any symbolic level of carbon pricing at the national level. So I don't think that carbon pricing alone is going to be a solution for the United States, but I would welcome it as part of our policy portfolio.
Thank you. So to take it back to the international dimension, there's a lot of interest in China. There's a lot of interest in having the three of you or any subset expand on China and relations with China and potential for collaboration around issues. But there are also questions related to Brazil, for example, and the relationship between the United States and Brazil. And that's going to go into a very different terrain starting tomorrow, and how that might impact some of the environmental issues that we're seeing in the Amazon and deforestation and other things. So who'd like to take that?
Well, let me start with China. As someone who helped negotiate the U.S.-China agreement in 2014, conditions are just really different from what they were like then. The U.S.-China relationship is so much more contentious, and there are so many more irritants in the relationship than there were before, whether it's, human rights issues or trade frictions or national security concerns. I think it's just going to be much harder for the U.S. and China to directly cooperate than it was then. However, I think it's essential that the U.S. and China establish quickly a channel for dialogue and discussion, and then ideally to find ways of breaking the ice on climate. And, I would put at the top of my list development finance. I think if the United States and China were to work together on greening their development finance, this is greening China's BRI and the United States matching that through, parallel kinds of endeavors, or maybe even directly cooperating together on climate-friendly development projects in third-party countries. I think that could be a really good way for us to proceed. I think it's less likely that we're going to be cooperating on technology cooperation than we did before, though I still think there's some scope for that in some domains. For example, demonstration projects on carbon capture and storage make a lot of sense for us to work on together. So first thing first is establish those channels of dialogue, and then, think about finding ways to start building trust and gaining confidence with each other on the climate issue.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else? Michael, Jason?
Well, Bolsonaro, of course, has been seen as the Trump of Latin America, and we're about to get rid of Trump, but not Bolsonaro. I think that the rapid development in the Amazon is a very negative step in the climate world, but I'm not sure how much leverage the U.S. is inclined to exercise to try to turn that around.
There's a question that I think comes from the UK, Richard Oblath, about hydrogen. And the question that Richard poses is, why has there not been enough focus on hydrogen in the United States? Now, I don't know enough, but I'm just passing on that question.
Well, it's changing really quickly. I mean, you can't sort of turn around anymore, I feel like, in conversations about the energy transition without having a conversation about hydrogen. And I view that as encouraging, because I do think, as I said earlier, we're going to need all of it. And the IEA, half of the emission reductions coming from technologies that are not yet commercially available. Hydrogen does a lot of different things. It may be part of the solution for decarbonizing parts of transportation, like ammonia in shipping, or hydrogen in heavy duty trucks. When we think about decarbonizing the building sector, a lot of that is going to be through electrification and efficiency, but we may think about, we're starting to see jurisdictions that are already putting hydrogen into the natural gas infrastructure. Heavy industry is a very hard to abate sector, and hydrogen may play a role there. So I think this is getting a huge amount of additional attention and interest now from major companies around the world. There's some disagreement about, well, are we talking about all types of hydrogen? If you look in the European Union, green hydrogen, which is currently more expensive, but I think the cost of that can come down quite a bit, which would be hydrogen made from renewable energy and electrolysis. You could also do methane steam reformation, blue hydrogen, which would be natural gas with carbon capture. So different jurisdictions are going to take different approaches. And there are many countries that are imagining this as a significant part of their energy mix moving forward, particularly parts of the world that have very strong renewable energy resources. We're hosting this and put this event together, Safwan, in part with our colleagues in Santiago at the Columbia Global Center in Chile. Chile has tremendous solar resources, and they have talked about trying to take those solar resources and turn them into green hydrogen and be a hydrogen supplier to the world. Some of the Gulf Arab states, which are thinking about what transition away from oil in the long term may mean for them, have also made moves to invest in the abundant solar they have and trying to think about being hydrogen suppliers. So a huge amount of additional attention on this topic, and I think that is welcome. We have a lot of colleagues at Columbia who are studying this quite a bit.
I agree. I think that hydrogen, any color other than green, is moving in the wrong direction. But green hydrogen also has the potential to solve the intermittency problem with wind and solar. It's a way that you can use the excess energy and store it. So I think it has enormous potential and will get much more attention in the U.S.
Great. So let me now turn to sort of two separate questions, but I'm going to try to connect them in a way. And that is a lot of questions about fracking, and we haven't really talked that much about it. Sort of, what do you anticipate the Biden administration is going to be dealing with fracking, and what the challenges ahead might be? And a not exactly related question, but a number of people have asked about whether there are good models within the United States. Have some counties, have some states adopted um, some measures and policies that could be considered best practices, that could be highlighted, that could be learned from?
Well, on the fracking, of course, Biden during his campaign said many times that he would not ban fracking. He
Right.
couldn't ban fracking even if he wanted to outside of federal lands with existing federal authority. But I think we will see seriously addressing the methane leakage problem, which turns out to be a significant issue. And there are existing authorities under the Clean Air Act and other laws to greatly control that. I don't think that Congress would need to act to really give the authority to ban it, and I don't see that happening. But fracking has obviously led to an enormous increase in both oil production and natural gas production, and that's not the direction we want to be going in. That much more attention, needs to be diverted to renewables.
Yeah, I agree with Michael. I would just add, I think, Michael, you mentioned earlier the campaign commitment not to ban fracking, but also no new leasing on public lands.
Right.
And that most of the shale activities on private lands, but there is some on public lands, like in New Mexico. And obviously the public lands would include the offshore. So that's not shale activity, but a lot of oil and gas production in the Gulf of Mexico.
So there would be some limits, is what you're saying. Not a reversal, but some limitation. And on the question of, are there states that one can point to, or counties, or, other geographies, if you will, within the United States where we can say, they're doing some of the right things at the local level? I guess the question is, everything that we've been talking about for the past 85 minutes or so has really been focused on the federal level, right? What about at the more local level of government?
So a year and a half ago, New York State adopted a law called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which is a very aggressive law that requires very significant increases in renewable energy and reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. To implement that, New York State more recently passed a law on siting of renewable energy that's going to expedite the approval of these facilities. New York is now developing the plan. The plan isn't due for another year and a half, but there are a lot of working groups that are active and that are really, I think, advancing the state of the art in how to control this. We have a website called the New York State Climate Law Tracker that is keeping track of all of this. But I think that if New York continues the vigorous program that it has adopted under Governor Cuomo, I think that it may become a model. Right now, it's emerging as a model. I wouldn't yet say that we're there yet.
Thank you. Thank you. So a last question before I turn to you for closing remarks, and this is coming from me. How do you think, one of the challenges that Biden is going to be facing broadly beyond climate is, of course, how he strikes the right balance within the Democratic Party and, within Congress and beyond, especially that the face of the Democratic Party has been gradually changing and is likely to change even more so over the next 10 years. How do you think he will balance, sort of the more centrist with the more leftist sort of elements around climate? And here I'm talking about the new Green Deal, for example, the Green New Deal. How will his policies around climate change help him in his effort to bring everybody together, or will it pose challenges? Kelly, maybe let's start with you.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think he's already off to a strong start. He clearly was very thoughtful about his appointments and trying to bring different perspectives to key positions in his administration. I honestly think that really going beyond just the Democratic Party, but developing the political consensus to really do what we need to do on climate in the United States requires rethinking our approach to climate policy in this country. We really need to think about it much more as an economic development strategy. And this goes to the questions of the just transition. How do we help those rural communities that are legitimately strongly dependent on fossil fuel industries for local tax bases? If the local coal mine is responsible for all the tax revenue for a given community that's paying for public schools and local roads and so forth, you need to be able to provide an alternative to that community. You need to be able to provide a different jobs pathway. And so what we really need to do is rethink our economic development strategy and think about how to position the United States to succeed in a low carbon economy. And once you reframe your thinking that way, your policy approach changes. You start to invest in the human capital that I mentioned earlier, the vocational training. You take a very regional approach to economic development. You identify where there's comparative advantage in the United States, region by region, and you start to build back our US economy in a clean way. And I think that would, transform US politics if we were to think about this as an opportunity rather than a, left-right issue.
That's beautiful. That really is very hopeful. Thank you, Kelly.
Yeah, and I agree with that. Let me just say, for a long time, there was the tradition in the United States that the most powerful members of Congress were the ones who managed to get military bases and other facilities in their districts and a lot of jobs. And we need to be looking at where the jobs are, where the jobs would be created, put a lot of them in West Virginia and Louisiana and places that rely heavily on fossil fuels, put a lot of them in low-income and minority communities that are traditionally disadvantaged both by the lack of jobs and by the excess of pollution. The massive public works program that we need will include a huge amount of manufacturing of all of the components, and the government can play a major role in where that goes and where the job opportunities are created. And I think that could go a long way to creating the constituencies that are needed in order to advance strong climate policies.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to, just ask each of you in 30 to 60 seconds, any closing remarks. This has just been incredibly instructive and wonderful. So I can't really thank you enough for contributing so generously of your insights. But let me, give each of you a chance to have any concluding remarks. Michael, I'm going to start with you.
So Joe Biden has accurately characterized climate change as an existential threat. And unless we very seriously challenge it, it's going to, meet the challenge. We're going to have horrible international as well as domestic issues with international migration and many other things that have the potential to destabilize societies around the world. But the size of the challenge needs to be met by the size of the opportunity. And I think the young people who are listening to this call need to realize that there are just tremendous career opportunities in pursuing the solutions to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and to drawing down the CO2 that's in the atmosphere and to preparing for the climate change that is coming. It is a massive challenge, but we have ideas on how to solve it, and I hope everybody here puts themselves to work to address those problems.
Thank you, Michael. A great call to action. And, for many young people around the world who are wondering what the future is going to look like for them, especially those who are students, there are opportunities in climate, deploy yourself in that field. Kelly, if I may turn to you.
Yeah, I'll keep this short. I mean, I think so far in the United States, we haven't really tried to address this issue of global climate change. And imagine how much progress we could make if we just tried. And I'm really excited that we have this new administration and new Congress, and it's up to all of us all the participants in the call, all of us who have been speaking, to really make extraordinary effort to try to solve this problem. Now's our chance. We have a good opportunity to make a difference right now.
Thank you. Thank you, Kelly. Jason?
Well, I'll put just a note of caution on Kelly's wonderful sense of optimism. I agree. We are going to try, and hopefully, and we'll need to try even more. And that's a reason to see the glasses half full. I also think it's important that when we talk about goals like well below 2 degrees or net zero or deep decarbonization, we have a full appreciation for how staggeringly difficult it is to think about goals like that. This year, we put much of the global economy on hold for most of the year. We shut down the global economy to deal with the pandemic, and carbon emissions are going to fall about 8 or 9% this year. If you want to achieve 1.5 degrees, they need to fall by that same amount each and every year for the rest of the decade. So that gives one a sense of how staggeringly difficult it is to grow the global economy, to raise people into higher levels of prosperity, to have increased population and GDP growth, which traditionally has told us where energy and therefore emissions growth would go, and to do all of that while rapidly decarbonizing the global economy. So we need stronger policy, we need private capital coming in, we need investments in innovation and new technological developments. We're going to need all of that to come anywhere close, and we need to up our game and our ambition.
Thank you. Thank you to Michael, to Kelly, to Jason. This has been brilliant. This has really been amazing. I can't thank you enough. And thanks to the Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia and to the Columbia Global Center in Santiago, Chris and Karen and everybody who has worked on this. And thanks to our audience for participating and for your questions. Thanks so much.